From the ashes of a revolution, an empire had risen, built by the genius and ambition of a single man. But now, on the vast, frozen plains of Russia, that empire had met its destiny, and its foundations were irrevocably shaken. The year was 1813. And as the first thaws of a European spring began to melt the snow, the shattered remnants of what was once the mightiest army in the world began to stagger home. The disastrous Russian campaign of 1812 had done more than just defeat Napoleon, it had decimated his once mighty Grand Army. From over 600,000 men who had marched with such confidence across the Niemen River, only a mere 30,000 combat-ready soldiers returned. They were ghosts returning to a nation in shock, their haunted eyes and frostbitten limbs a testament to the catastrophe that had befallen them. For years, the continent had held its breath in the face of Napoleon's power. But now, as Europe's powers sensed his weakness, they began to stir. A new hope, and with it, a new desire for vengeance, swept across the lands he had conquered. His carefully constructed empire, a complex web of alliances and puppet states, began to crumble. The Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German states that had long served as a buffer between France and its eastern enemies, now wavered in its loyalty. Prussia, a nation long humiliated by French occupation and forced to march alongside Napoleon into Russia, saw its opportunity to rise again, to reassert its independence and restore its former glory. From the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean, conquered territories and restless kingdoms grew bold, anticipating the great empire's fall. Seizing this moment of French vulnerability, a new and powerful coalition of European nations emerged, the sixth such alliance to form against France since the Revolution. But this one was different. It brought together an unprecedented union of powers, all determined to end French hegemony once and for all. At its core were four major players, each with its own motivations for joining the fight against Napoleon. There was Russia, which, having repelled Napoleon's invasion, now sought to capitalize on its hard-won victory. Its leader, Tsar Alexander I, once an ally of Napoleon, now saw himself in a new, almost messianic role, as the liberator of Europe from French tyranny. There was Prussia, under King Frederick William III, a nation burning with a desire for revenge and national restoration. For years, Prussian reformers had been quietly modernizing their army and instilling a fierce sense of patriotic fervor in the population, waiting for this very moment. There was Austria, under Emperor Francis I, which had maintained a cautious neutrality in the early stages of the conflict. Now, as the tide turned decisively against his son-in-law, Napoleon, the Austrian emperor saw an opportunity to regain lost territories and reassert his nation's position as a major European power. And there was Sweden, led by one of Napoleon's own former marshals, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, who joined the coalition with the promise of acquiring Norway. This was not all. In the background, Great Britain, Napoleon's most steadfast and implacable enemy, provided the fuel for this great war machine, offering substantial financial support to the coalition through subsidies and loans. And in the Iberian Peninsula, the bloody struggle of the Peninsular War continued to rage, tying down hundreds of thousands of valuable French forces that Napoleon desperately needed elsewhere. In response to this gathering storm, this world of enemies, Napoleon worked feverishly in Paris to rebuild his army. His energy seemed boundless, his will unbreakable. He ordered a massive conscription effort, calling upon the youth of France to fill the depleted ranks of his legions. He called up young men, and even teenagers, many of whom were so young they came to be known as the Marie-Louises, after the Empress. The French emperor's ability to raise and equip new forces in such a short period of time was nothing short of remarkable. Yet, everyone knew that the quality of these hastily trained troops, brave and loyal as they were, could not match that of the hardened veterans who now lay buried in the Russian snow. Germany, with its central location, was destined to become the strategic fulcrum of this final conflict. It would be the great chessboard upon which the upcoming confrontation between Napoleon and the combined forces of the coalition would be played out. As spring turned to summer in 1813, the tensions mounted. The great armies began to mobilize, a river of steel and humanity flowing from all directions toward the heart of Germany. Napoleon, sensing the storm was about to break, launched a preemptive campaign, hoping to strike and defeat his enemies before they could fully unite their overwhelming forces. The stage was now set for a confrontation of unprecedented scale. The fate of an empire, and of a continent, hung in the balance, and all eyes now turned to a prosperous city in Saxony, a place called Leipzig. As the spring of 1813 turned to summer, the heart of Europe transformed into a vast chessboard, upon which the fate of the continent would be decided. Germany, with its central location, its network of rivers, and its open plains, became the strategic fulcrum of the conflict. Napoleon, recognizing this, launched a preemptive campaign, hoping to use his characteristic speed and brilliance to defeat his enemies before they could fully unite their overwhelming forces. He was once again the aggressor, taking the fight to them, seeking that one decisive battle that had so often been the key to his greatest triumphs. But the men he faced now were different. They were not the same generals who had been so consistently outwitted in the past. They had learned from their defeats. They had studied their opponent. And they had devised a new and ingenious plan. This new strategy was known as the Trachenberg Plan. It represented a profound paradigm shift in how the coalition approached combating Napoleon. For years, they had played his game, allowing him to dictate the terms of engagement, seeking him out for a single, glorious, winner-take-all battle, a contest in which his tactical genius almost always prevailed. The Trachenberg Plan was a declaration that they would play his game no longer. The core of the plan was simple, yet brilliant: they would avoid Napoleon himself. If the emperor commanded the main French force in person, the Allied army facing him would refuse battle and execute a strategic withdrawal. At the same time, all other Allied armies would advance and attack the smaller French detachments commanded by his marshals. It was a strategy designed to turn Napoleon's greatest strength, his own presence on the battlefield, into a weakness. He could not be everywhere at once. What followed was a grand and frustrating dance across the German countryside. Napoleon would move with his customary speed, seeking to concentrate his forces for a decisive strike against one of the main coalition armies. He might target the army of Bohemia to the south, commanded by the cautious Austrian Prince Schwarzenberg. But as he advanced, he would find his enemy melting away, refusing to give battle, drawing him deeper into hostile territory. Meanwhile, news would arrive that the fiery Prussian General Blücher, commanding the army of Silesia, had attacked and defeated one of his marshals to the east. Or that the army of the north, led by his own former marshal, Bernadotte, was pressing down from the north. It was a war against a phantom, a multi-headed hydra. Every time he moved to strike one of its heads, another would attack him from behind. This strategy gradually wore down the French forces, disrupting their supply lines and forcing them into a series of smaller, attritional battles that they could ill afford. This complex series of feints, marches, and countermarches inevitably drew all the pieces on the great chessboard toward a single point of concentration. All roads, it seemed, now led to the prosperous Saxon city of Leipzig. Situated at the confluence of several rivers, its landscape was a complex mixture of marshlands, open ground, and small villages, a battlefield that would test the tactical acumen of both sides to its absolute limit. And as the armies converged, the sheer, staggering scale of the coming confrontation became apparent. Like great storm clouds gathering on the horizon from all points of the compass, the forces of the coalition amassed an overwhelming host. Approximately 360,000 soldiers, supported by an immense artillery train of 1,500 guns, were marching towards the city. To face them, Napoleon's new Grand Army, a force built on the will of its emperor and the courage of France's young sons, now stood at around 225,000 troops, with 700 guns. This significant numerical disadvantage placed an immense and almost unbearable pressure on the French emperor's legendary strategic brilliance. On the eve of the battle, an eerie calm settled over the fields surrounding Leipzig. The atmosphere among the troops was electric with a palpable tension, a mixture of grim determination and profound anxiety. Soldiers on both sides were acutely aware of the historical significance of the moment. They knew they stood on the precipice of the largest battle the continent had ever witnessed, with the future of Europe hanging in the balance. The presence of the Allied monarchs themselves on the battlefield, Tsar Alexander I of Russia in particular taking a hands-on approach, underscored the unprecedented stakes. This was no longer just a military engagement, it was a final judgment on an entire era. As night fell, thousands upon thousands of campfires dotted the landscape, two vast cities of men and horses, poised for the conflict that would erupt at dawn. Across the field, Napoleon made his final preparations, his mind, even now, searching for that single, brilliant stroke that would grant him one more impossible victory. The first light of dawn broke over the fields of Leipzig on October 16, 1813, illuminating a scene of impending, almost unimaginable, chaos. The mist rising from the Pleiss and Par the rivers seemed to cling to the ground, shrouding the two vast armies as they made their final preparations. A profound and heavy silence had settled over the landscape, the kind of quiet that precedes a great storm. Then, as the sun climbed higher, the storm broke. The coalition forces launched a massive, coordinated assault against Napoleon's southern flank, and the Battle of Nations began. The initial focus of the Allied attack was a series of small, unassuming villages that would soon become the epicenters of a brutal, swirling struggle. A Prussian corps, commanded by General Kleist, advanced along the Pleiss River, their objective the village of Markkleeberg. The village was defended by Prince Józef Poniatowski's Polish troops, men who fought with a fierce loyalty to Napoleon, who they saw as the only hope for their own nation's restoration. The early morning hours witnessed a ferocious contest for control of this small cluster of stone houses and muddy streets. The Prussians stormed the village, engaging the Poles in desperate, close-quarters combat. Despite their valiant defense, Poniatowski's forces were eventually forced to yield the village. However, the Prussians found themselves unable to capitalize on this hard-won victory. They were immediately pinned down by a devastating and accurate barrage from French artillery, which prevented any further advance. Nearby, other Allied troops under Eugen of Württemberg seized the town of Wachau, but their success was similarly short-lived, as they too found themselves at the mercy of the superior French cannon fire. By 11 a.m., the initial momentum of the great Allied attack had dissipated, stalled in a series of bloody struggles for these small, fortified villages. Napoleon, seeing his opportunity, ordered a massive counterattack. 150 French cannons opened fire in concert, their thunderous roar signaling a dramatic shift in the tide of battle. This was the prelude to his broader counteroffensive, a great wave of French forces sweeping forward in dense attack columns, led by some of his most famous marshals. Then came the moment of high drama. At the head of 10,000 French horsemen, Napoleon's famously flamboyant and daring brother-in-law, Joachim Murat, led a massive cavalry charge against the Allied center. It was a sight of terrible, breathtaking beauty. A great river of men and horses, cuirassiers in their shining steel breastplates and dragoons with their horsehair-plumed helmets, thundered across the battlefield, the ground trembling beneath their hooves. The charge drove deep into the enemy territory, shattering the Allied lines and coming perilously close to the command post of Tsar Alexander himself. For a moment, it seemed as if a single, glorious charge might decide the entire battle. However, the marshy ground in the center of the field slowed the cavalry's momentum, their horses struggling in the soft earth. And the French infantry, meant to follow in their wake and exploit the breakthrough, failed to provide timely support. The great wave of cavalry, having crested, now began to recede, its force blunted, its opportunity lost. For the rest of the long afternoon, the battle devolved into a brutal, grinding war of attrition. The villages of Markkleeberg, Wachau, and Liebertwolkwitz became charnel houses, changing hands multiple times as soldiers on both sides displayed remarkable courage and endurance. The coalition troops showed a new tenacity, regrouping and launching counterattacks with a resilience that had been absent in previous campaigns. The French forces, though outnumbered, demonstrated their experience and skill in holding their ground, their artillery proving crucial in stalling Allied advances and providing cover for their own maneuvers. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the fields, the fighting slowly subsided. The first day of the Battle of Leipzig had come to a brutal and inconclusive end. An uneasy quiet settled over the southern front, a quiet punctuated by the groans of the thousands of wounded who lay scattered among the dead. Neither side could claim a decisive victory. The day had ended in a costly stalemate. The fields south of Leipzig were strewn with the silent witnesses to the ferocity of the fight, with some 25,000 French casualties and 30,000 Allied losses. The battle was far from over, and as the commanders looked towards the next day, they knew that this was only the beginning. As the great cavalry charge of Murat stalled in the marshy ground south of Leipzig, and the struggle for the southern villages devolved into a brutal, grinding stalemate, another furious storm was breaking to the north of the city. Here, the fiery and relentless Prussian Field Marshal Gebhard von Blücher, a man whose 70 years had not dimmed the burning hatred he felt for Napoleon, commanded his army of Silesia. He was known to his adoring soldiers as Marshal Vorwärts, or Marshal Forward, a testament to his relentlessly aggressive nature. He saw before him the French 6th Corps, commanded by Marshal Marmont, and he was determined to smash it, to exact a piece of the vengeance for which Prussia had thirsted for years. What unfolded at the village of Mockern was not a battle of grand maneuvers, but a savage, close-quarters infantry brawl that would become one of the bloodiest and most decisive episodes of the entire day. Imagine the village of Mockern, a seemingly peaceful collection of sturdy stone houses, walled gardens, and narrow, defensible lanes. In the hands of Marmont's veterans, considered one of the very best and most experienced corps in the French army, it transformed into a formidable, improvised fortress. Blücher, true to his aggressive nature, ordered his Prussian troops, under the command of General York, to storm the position. The Prussians, burning with a new and powerful patriotic fervor to liberate their homeland, advanced with incredible courage, time and time again, into the teeth of the French defenses. The battle quickly became a nightmarish, swirling melee in the streets and houses. Every stone wall was a barricade, every window a firing position from which French muskets spat fire. The fighting was hand-to-hand, a desperate struggle for every doorway, every garden, every inch of ground. A single large manor house at the center of the village became a charnel house, its rooms and hallways changing hands a dozen times in a storm of bayonets and musket butts. As the fighting intensified, Marshal Marmont, watching his lines bend under the relentless pressure, found himself in a precarious and deeply frustrating position. He saw a critical moment, a fleeting opportunity for a decisive cavalry charge to sweep the staggered Prussian columns from the field and relieve the pressure on his exhausted infantry. He sent the order. But in a shocking act of insubordination that highlighted the growing cracks in the French command structure, his cavalry commander refused to charge. Whether from exhaustion, misjudgment, or a breakdown in discipline, the cavalry remained passive. Forced to act without this crucial support, Marmont had no choice but to throw his infantry reserves alone into the meat grinder, a decision that proved immensely costly in lives but necessary to hold the line. The battle for Mauchern raged on well into the night, the darkness illuminated by the hellish, flickering glow of the village itself, which was now on fire. The air was filled with the thunder of artillery, which caused the majority of the casualties on both sides. By the time the fighting finally subsided, leaving the village a smoldering ruin, the fields around it were littered with some 16,000 dead or wounded soldiers from both armies. And at the very same time, another crucial engagement was unfolding on the Western Front, a quieter but strategically vital struggle at the suburb of Lindenau. Here, the Austrian Third Corps under General July had initially made significant headway against the French defenders. This was not just another attack, it was a direct strike at the French army's most vulnerable point. Lindenau controlled the road and the single, crucial bridge over the Elster River that served as the only potential line of retreat for Napoleon's entire army. If this position fell, the French would be completely encircled, trapped with their backs to the river, facing certain annihilation. Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, who was responsible for the entire northern half of the battlefield, recognized the immense and immediate danger. He was forced to make a difficult, agonizing decision. He diverted General Bertrand's entire Fourth Corps, fresh troops that were desperately needed to either support Marmont at Mauchern or to participate in Napoleon's main attack in the south, and sent them west to hold the position at Lindenau at all costs. It was a critical sacrifice, a clear illustration of the impossible strategic dilemma Napoleon faced. The fighting at Lindenau matched the intensity of Mauchern in its importance, if not in its sheer ferocity. The French and Austrian troops grappled for control of the suburb, the tide of battle ebbing and flowing throughout the long day. Though July's initial success had been alarming, Bertrand's men, knowing they were defending the entire army's lifeline, managed to hold their ground, preventing the Austrians from severing this crucial artery. As night fell on the 16th of October, an exhausted silence descended upon the vast, circular battlefield. The first day of the Battle of Nations was over. On the southern front, a bloody stalemate. On the northern front, a smoldering ruin. And on the western front, a precariously held line of retreat. Napoleon had not been defeated, his lines had not been broken, but the cost had been terrible. The coalition's multi-pronged assault, while not achieving a single decisive breakthrough, had perfectly executed the spirit of the Trachenberg Plan. It had bled Napoleon's army on three fronts simultaneously, tied down his crucial reserves, and demonstrated that the sheer weight of numbers and the grim determination of a united Europe was a force that even the genius of the emperor might not be able to overcome. As the sun rose on October 17, 1813, an eerie and unnatural calm settled over the vast battlefield surrounding Leipzig. The thunder of the previous day's cannons, a sound that had shaken the very earth, had fallen silent. It was replaced now by the low moans of the thousands of wounded that lay scattered across the fields, and the grim, methodical work of the surgeons in the makeshift field hospitals. A damp, autumn mist mingled with the lingering, acrid smoke from the burning villages of Markkleeberg and Mauchern, shrouding the landscape in a ghostly grey veil. In the French camp, soldiers, their faces blackened with gunpowder, their uniforms torn and bloodied, their bodies aching with a profound exhaustion, tended to their weapons. They looked with grim apprehension towards the enemy lines, knowing that this fragile pause was not peace, but merely the drawing of a deeper breath before an even greater fury was to be unleashed. For Napoleon, this day of respite was a moment of intense and critical calculation. The first day had ended in a bloody stalemate. He had not been defeated, but he had failed to achieve the decisive victory his situation so desperately required. Then, a glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon. A force of 14,000 fresh troops, General Rainier's French-Saxon 7th Corps, arrived to reinforce his battered army. A weary cheer might have gone up from the ranks as they watched these fresh troops march into camp. It was a much-needed injection of strength, a sign that they were not completely abandoned. But this small glimmer of hope was about to be extinguished by a deluge. From the French observation posts, telescopes scanned the eastern and northern horizons, and what they saw sent a chill through the hearts of even the most veteran commanders. It was not a single column, but a sea of men, an entire nation on the march. The coalition's ranks were swelling with the arrival of over 145,000 fresh soldiers. The massive Austrian First Corps under General Colloredo, the vast army of Poland commanded by the Russian General Bennigsen, and his own former Marshal Bernadotte's Army of the North were all arriving, their endless columns of infantry, cavalry, and artillery filling the landscape as far as the eye could see. It was a human tide, a slow, inexorable closing of a massive steel trap. The scales of the battle, which had been so precariously balanced the day before, now tipped decisively and catastrophically against the French. Faced with these truly overwhelming odds, with his army now outnumbered nearly 2-to-1, the most logical and prudent course of action would have been to order an immediate retreat, to use the cover of this pause to withdraw his forces across the single, fragile bridge at Lindenau and save his army from certain annihilation. His marshals, his staff, all knew it. But Napoleon, his mind a complex mixture of brilliant calculation, unwavering self-belief, and a gambler's pride, made the fateful choice to stand his ground. Perhaps he believed he could still conjure a miracle from the jaws of despair. Perhaps he believed that a retreat now would cause his young, inexperienced army to disintegrate into a panicked mob. Or perhaps his pride simply would not allow him to yield the field. Whatever the reason, he chose to stay. The atmosphere in the French headquarters grew increasingly grim. A chilling report was delivered to the emperor, a stark summary of their material weakness that underscored the desperation of their situation. "All ammunition stocks have been used up," the report stated. "We have not enough to maintain combat for 1 hour." They were an army without thunder, their hundreds of cannons, their greatest advantage on the battlefield, now in danger of falling silent. With his military options dwindling, Napoleon made one final diplomatic maneuver. He attempted to negotiate an armistice, sending a captured Austrian general as an emissary with a message directly to his father-in-law, Emperor Francis I of Austria. He suggested concessions, a desperate bid to find a crack in the coalition's unity, to split the Allies and save his empire. But the Allies, united in their purpose and now overwhelmingly confident in their advantage, rebuffed his overtures. The time for talk was over. They could sense that total victory, the final downfall of the man who had dominated them for over a decade, was finally within their grasp. They were determined to press their advantage to its bloody conclusion. As his last hope for a negotiated settlement vanished, Napoleon received intelligence of the coalition's own plans. Their commanders, in a great council of war attended by 3 monarchs, had agreed on a strategy for the following day, a series of 6 coordinated, simultaneous attacks from all sides, designed to completely encircle his forces and crush them in a ring of fire and steel. The noose was being prepared, and it was tightening. As night fell on October 17, a profound sense of doom settled over the French camp. The soldiers, huddled around their meager campfires, could see the horizon in every direction lit up by the seemingly endless ocean of enemy fires. They were an island in a sea of hostility. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and desperately low on ammunition. They now faced the grim reality that the coming day would likely be their last. Across the field, the coalition forces buzzed with anticipation, their commanders issuing their final orders, their soldiers sharpening their weapons, all of them aware that they were on the verge of a victory that would reshape the map of Europe. The day of respite was over. The stage was set for the final, dramatic climax of the Battle of Nations. Part 6, The Final Assault and the Lost Bridge. As the grey, cold dawn of October 18 broke over the fields of Leipzig, the air itself crackled with a final, terrible tension. The brief respite was over. The French army, now completely surrounded, outnumbered, and desperately low on ammunition, braced for the final storm. Across the field, the vast, multinational forces of the coalition began to move. Their carefully orchestrated plan of 6 simultaneous attacks was set in motion, a great, contracting circle of steel designed to crush the beleaguered French army in the center. Napoleon, aware of the impending onslaught, had fortified his new, shortened defensive lines, particularly in the south, where the village of Probstheata, a small cluster of sturdy stone buildings and walled gardens, would become the focal point, the very crucible, of the day's most brutal and desperate fighting. The Allied forces launched their relentless assaults against this position, wave after wave of Austrian, Prussian, and Russian infantry throwing themselves against the French defenses. The village became a charnel house, its streets choked with smoke and the bodies of the fallen. The fighting was savage, a desperate, close-quarters struggle for every house and every wall. But the most significant blow to the French on this day would not come from an enemy bayonet, but from a wound inflicted from within. A pivotal and heartbreaking moment of betrayal unfolded on the battlefield. The Saxon troops, who had been fighting as allies alongside the French, suddenly, in the heat of combat, defected to the coalition. 5,400 men, with their cannons and their banners, simply turned around and joined the ranks of the enemy. Imagine the shock and disbelief in the French lines as they saw their comrades turn their guns upon them. It was a devastating blow to morale, a betrayal that sent a chill of despair through an army that was already strained to its absolute limit. Throughout the long and brutal day, Napoleon, the master tactician, now found himself acting as a desperate firefighter. From his command post, he watched as his lines bent and buckled under the immense pressure. He frantically moved his dwindling reserves from one threatened sector to another, plugging gaps, ordering counterattacks, searching for any weakness in the Allied lines that he could possibly exploit. He hoped to create an opening, a momentary gap that would allow him to break the tightening noose around his army. But the sheer, overwhelming numbers of the coalition forces and their coordinated assault strategy thwarted his efforts at every turn. His cannons, his greatest weapon, were beginning to fall silent. The report from the previous day had been dire, and now, by the afternoon, his forces faced a desperate situation, with barely enough ammunition to sustain the fight. By nightfall on October 18, 1813, even Napoleon could no longer deny the inevitable. He had held his ground, his soldiers had fought with incredible courage, but the battle was lost. Surrounded, outmatched, and with his army on the verge of complete collapse, he made the painful decision to order a general retreat. Under the cover of darkness, the difficult and dangerous withdrawal began. The entire French army, with its remaining cannons, its thousands of wounded, and its baggage train, had to funnel its way through the narrow, winding streets of Leipzig and across a single, narrow bridge over the deep and swift-moving Elster River. This bridge became a terrible choke point, a bottleneck that would test the limits of the army's discipline and ultimately lead to a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. As dawn broke, the city of Leipzig transformed into a maelstrom of chaos. The once orderly Grande Armée, the most disciplined force in Europe, found itself in disarray, with soldiers, wagons, and artillery all struggling and pushing to get through the narrow streets toward the single point of escape. The French rear guard, tasked with holding off the advancing coalition forces, fought with incredible bravery in the city's suburbs, buying precious time for the army to cross. But they were buying time for an army that was caught in a desperate, immovable gridlock. Then came the moment that would be etched into military history as a symbol of tragic error. A French corporal, who had been given the critical task of destroying the Elster Bridge to halt the Allied pursuit after the army had crossed, made a fateful mistake. Seeing a group of coalition skirmishers approaching, and fearing that the bridge would be captured, he, in a moment of panic and a misinterpretation of his orders, ignited the fuse prematurely. He lit the charge while the bridge was still crowded with thousands of retreating French troops, wagons, and the last of the artillery. The explosion that followed was catastrophic. In an instant, the last route of escape was severed. Approximately 30,000 French soldiers were trapped on the wrong side of the river. A great cry of horror and despair rose up from the trapped men. Panic and chaos spread like wildfire. Soldiers, faced with the choice of certain capture or death, began to throw themselves into the churning, cold waters of the river in a desperate attempt to swim to safety. Many were pulled under by the current and drowned. Among those caught in this desperate situation was Marshal Józef Poniatowski, one of Napoleon's most loyal and capable commanders, a Polish prince who had been promoted to the rank of Marshal of the Empire just days before. Wounded and exhausted, he refused to surrender. In a final act of defiance, he rode his horse into the river, attempting to swim across. He disappeared beneath the waters, his fate a poignant and tragic symbol of the French army's utter collapse. The destruction of the bridge marked the final, chaotic end of the Battle of Nations. What had begun as an organized withdrawal had now spiraled into a desperate rout, leaving a third of Napoleon's remaining army to face capture or death in the wake of this disaster. In the wake of his first abdication on April 6, 1814, the great powers of Europe exiled Napoleon Bonaparte to the small Mediterranean island of Elba. The Treaty of Fontainebleau granted him sovereignty over this tiny speck of land, a domain measuring only 224 square kilometers, and it allowed him to retain his grand title of emperor. It was a gilded cage, a beautiful prison. Imagine the man who had once commanded a continent, whose armies had marched from the deserts of Egypt to the frozen plains of Russia, now pacing the shores of his miniature kingdom. The air was warm, the sea was blue, but for a mind as restless and boundless as his, the isolation was a form of torture. Yet, Napoleon's incredible energy did not diminish in exile. He quickly set about implementing reforms on the small island, improving its infrastructure and economy, demonstrating the same capacity for governance that had once allowed him to dominate a continent. But these activities were merely a facade, a way to occupy a mind that was constitutionally unable to remain idle. His gaze was always turned northward, across the sea, towards France. Throughout his time on Elba, Napoleon maintained a secret network of informants who kept him apprised of the events unfolding in the kingdom he had lost. Under the cover of darkness, small fishing boats would land in secluded coves, bringing letters and messengers with news. The reports that reached him were intriguing. The restored Bourbon monarchy, under King Louis XVIII, was proving to be clumsy and increasingly unpopular. The government, in its attempt to turn back the clock and erase the legacy of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic eras, was alienating large segments of the population. The army, in particular, felt humiliated, its glorious banners replaced, its veterans cast aside. At the same time, discussions were taking place at the Great Congress of Vienna about potentially moving him to a more remote Atlantic island, a place from which escape would be truly impossible. This added a sense of urgency to his plans. He began to see an opportunity, a narrow path back to power. He started to make preparations for his escape, conducting his plans in the utmost secrecy. On the 26th of February 1815, after less than a year in exile, Napoleon set his audacious gamble in motion. Under the cover of darkness, he slipped away from the island's main port, setting sail with a small force of approximately 1,000 men, a contingent composed mainly of the loyal members of his imperial guard who had accompanied him into exile. As his small ship, the Inconstant, sailed away from Elba's shores, navigating past the watchful but temporarily absent British naval patrols, the stage was set for one of history's most remarkable comebacks. On March 1, 1815, the shores of France loomed before him. His landing near Antibes marked the start of a daring campaign that would send shock waves across Europe. Choosing a perilous route through the snow-covered Alps to avoid the royalist strongholds in the south, his small force began its march northward. The pivotal moment of this march, the moment on which all of history seemed to turn, came near the town of Laffrey. Here, a royalist battalion of the 5th Regiment of the Line, sent to arrest him, blocked the road. Napoleon's small force was vastly outnumbered. A single command, a single volley of musket fire, could have ended his dream forever. But Napoleon, in a moment of supreme courage and psychological mastery, ordered his own men to lower their weapons. He dismounted his horse and walked forward alone, until he was within pistol shot of the opposing soldiers who had their muskets leveled directly at him. He stopped, opened his familiar grey greatcoat to expose his chest, and uttered the famous, unwavering words, "Here I am. Kill your emperor, if you wish." A profound silence fell over the snowy pass. The soldiers of the royalist battalion, men who had once served under his banner, looked at the familiar figure before them. They saw not a usurper, but their emperor, the little corporal, who had led them to glory on a dozen battlefields. An officer gave the order to fire, but no one moved. The soldiers stood frozen for a heart-stopping moment. Then, one of them lowered his musket. Then another. And then, a single cry erupted from the ranks, "Vive l'Empereur! Long live the Emperor!" The cry was taken up by others, until the entire battalion, with tears streaming down their faces, had rallied to his side. This dramatic reversal at Laffrey became a turning point, transforming Napoleon's desperate gamble into a triumphal procession. As news of this event spread, it galvanized support across France. Former soldiers, yearning for the glory days of the Empire, flocked to join his growing force. His advance towards Paris became a river of loyalty, swelling with every town he passed. The restored Bourbon monarchy found itself increasingly isolated as troops defected and popular enthusiasm for the emperor grew. The king, Louis XVIII, realizing his rule was collapsing, fled the capital. On March 20, 1815, less than 3 weeks after landing on the coast, Napoleon entered Paris in triumph. He had reclaimed the French throne without firing a single shot. The eagle had landed. The news of his astonishing return sent shock waves through the halls of the Congress of Vienna. The fragile peace was shattered. The Allied powers quickly mobilized their armies, forming the Seventh Coalition, determined to extinguish this resurrected threat once and for all. Napoleon was once again Emperor of the French, but he now faced the combined might of all of Europe, which was gathering on his borders for one last, great battle. In the wake of the twin battles of Ligny and Quatre Bras, a critical phase of maneuvering began, a series of decisions that would ultimately shape the course of European history. Napoleon had achieved his last great battlefield triumph at Ligny, dealing a heavy blow to the Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher. But the victory was not decisive. The Prussian army, though battered, had not been destroyed. And at the crossroads of Quatre Bras, Marshal Ney had fought the Duke of Wellington to a costly stalemate, failing to seize the strategic position and allowing Wellington to maintain his connection with his Prussian allies. As the dust settled from these fierce engagements, Napoleon turned his attention to what he believed was his primary target, the British and their allies under the command of Wellington. In a fateful decision that would be debated by historians for centuries to come, Napoleon chose to split his army. He believed he had effectively neutralized the Prussian threat, assuming that after their defeat at Ligny, they would retreat eastward, away from Wellington. He therefore detached a significant force of 33,000 men under the command of Marshal Emmanuel de Grouchy, with orders to pursue the Prussians and prevent them from regrouping and rejoining the main conflict. This division of his army, while seemingly logical, carried significant risks and would have far-reaching and tragic consequences in the days to come. While Grouchy marched off in pursuit of a phantom, the two Allied commanders were making their own crucial decisions. The Duke of Wellington, upon learning of the Prussian defeat at Ligny, knew his position at Quatre Bras was no longer tenable. He initiated a skillful retrograde movement, a carefully planned and executed withdrawal, towards a new defensive position he had already scouted just south of the small Belgian village of Waterloo. This was not a panicked flight, but the cool, calculated maneuver of a master of defensive warfare, falling back to a piece of ground of his own choosing, a ridge that would offer his army significant tactical advantages. At the same time, miles to the east, the 72-year-old Prussian Field Marshal Blücher, despite suffering significant injuries during the Battle of Ligny, including being trapped for hours beneath his dead horse during a cavalry charge, made a momentous decision that would seal Napoleon's fate. His staff advised a retreat eastward, back toward Prussia, to lick their wounds and preserve their army. But Blücher, driven by an indomitable spirit and his promise to his British ally, made the courageous choice to march northward, maintaining a trajectory that would keep his army within supporting distance of Wellington's forces. This resolution, made in the face of physical pain and recent defeat, would prove to be one of the most consequential of the entire campaign. Then, nature itself intervened in the affairs of men. As Wellington's army withdrew and Napoleon's forces began their pursuit, the skies opened. A torrential downpour began, a relentless, drenching rain that transformed the Belgian countryside into a treacherous quagmire. The roads turned to deep, thick mud, clogging the advance of the French army. Their progress was reduced to a laborious slog. Artillery pieces, the great cannons that were Napoleon's primary weapon, sank deep into the mud, their heavy wheels unable to turn. Supply wagons became hopelessly bogged down. The infantry and cavalry struggled through the mire, their progress painfully slow. This delay, born of the elements, was a terrible tactical setback for Napoleon, robbing him of the speed he needed to catch Wellington's army before it could establish its new defensive position. It also served as a symbol of the unpredictable forces that were now shaping the campaign's outcome. As June 17 drew to a close, Wellington had successfully established his formidable defensive position along the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, just south of Waterloo. The French forces, delayed and exhausted by their struggle through the mud, slowly began to arrive and take up positions opposite him. Napoleon, who had hoped to catch Wellington in retreat, was instead confronted with the prospect of a pitched battle against a well-prepared enemy, occupying a strong defensive ground of his own choosing. As night fell on the eve of the great battle, the rain finally subsided, but the air was thick with a damp chill. The two armies, camped within sight of each other, could hear the sounds from the opposing lines, the neighing of horses, the low murmur of thousands of men. The fields between them were a sea of mud. The fate of Europe now rested on a delicate balance of factors: the resilience of Wellington's defensive line, Napoleon's ability to break it, and, most importantly, the timing of the Prussian reinforcements. Somewhere out in the darkness and the mud, Blücher's army was marching, a great unknown that would decide the future of an empire. The first light of dawn on June 18, 1815, revealed a landscape on the brink of history. The fields surrounding the small Belgian village of Waterloo were sodden and shrouded in a thick, heavy mist, the ground churned into a treacherous quagmire by the previous night's torrential rains. Across this muddy terrain, two formidable armies stood poised for battle. The Duke of Wellington, commanding the Allied forces, had chosen his ground with meticulous care. His troops were arrayed along the gentle slope of a ridge, a position that offered significant tactical advantages. Crucial to his defensive strategy were two fortified strong points, the Château of Hougoumont to his west, and the farmhouse of La Haye-Saint directly in front of his center. These stone buildings would serve as breakwaters, designed to disrupt and break up the French assault. Across the valley, Napoleon Bonaparte surveyed the battlefield with a keen, impatient eye. The sodden ground posed a significant challenge, delaying his plans. The artillery, his most powerful weapon, would be difficult to maneuver in the deep mud, its cannonballs losing much of their deadly bouncing effect. He waited for the ground to dry. His plan, characteristically bold, was to launch a diversionary attack on the chateau of Hougoumont, aiming to draw off Wellington's reserves to that flank. Then, he would strike with overwhelming force at the Allied center, splitting the army in two and destroying it before the Prussians could arrive. He exuded a powerful confidence, reportedly declaring to his staff, "I have them, 9 chances to 10, the victory is mine." At approximately 11:30 a.m., the opening salvo of the battle finally rang out. Napoleon's artillery began a massive bombardment of the Allied lines, and the first French infantry columns advanced on the chateau of Hougoumont. What was intended as a diversion quickly evolved into a fierce and desperate struggle that would last the entire day. The chateau and its surrounding orchard and woods became a cauldron of intense fighting, a battle within the battle, sucking in more and more French troops as Napoleon became obsessed with capturing the position. As the afternoon wore on, Napoleon launched his main assault on Wellington Center. A grand battery of 80 cannons opened fire, and then, the massive infantry columns of d'Erlon's corps advanced. But as they crested the ridge, they were met by a devastating countercharge from the British heavy cavalry. The ensuing melee was a chaotic swirl of horsemen and infantry, a brutal clash that ultimately repulsed the French attack. Following this, Napoleon unleashed his legendary cavalry. Under the command of the fiery Marshal Ney, thousands of French horsemen, cuirassiers in their shining steel breastplates and lancers with their deadly pennants, charged up the muddy slope. In response, Wellington's Allied infantry formed into their famous defensive squares. These human fortresses became islands of red-coated soldiers in a sea of French cavalry. Time and again, the French horsemen crashed against these bristling rows of bayonets, only to be repulsed by disciplined musket fire. The Duke himself rode along the line, encouraging his men. "Stand fast, 95th, he called out to one hard-pressed regiment, "What will they say of this in England?" His presence bolstered the morale of his troops, who withstood charge after charge despite mounting casualties. After a ferocious struggle, the French did manage to capture the crucial farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte, creating a dangerous bulge in Wellington's line. As the battle reached its climax, Napoleon, seeing his cavalry charges failing and knowing that time was running out, prepared to commit his last reserve, the Imperial Guard. These elite veterans, the legends of the Empire, had never known defeat in battle. Their advance would be the final gambit to break Wellington's army before the Prussians could arrive in force. But on the eastern edge of the battlefield, the first Prussian units under Field Marshal Blücher were already beginning to appear, threatening Napoleon's right flank. The Emperor now faced a desperate race against time. As the Imperial Guard began its majestic, final advance, a hush fell over the battlefield. Even the wounded seemed to hold their breath. But Wellington, recognizing the critical moment, had prepared his own surprise. He had concealed a brigade of fresh British Guards, having them lie down behind the crest of the ridge, hidden from French sight. As the Imperial Guard reached the top of the slope, their tall bearskin hats the first thing to appear over the rise, Wellington gave the order. "Now, Maitland. Now's your time." The British Guard stood up and delivered a single, devastating, point-blank volley. The effect was catastrophic. The French elite, caught completely by surprise, staggered under the weight of the fire. For the first time in its storied history, the Imperial Guard faltered. The sight of these invincible warriors hesitating, and then falling back, sent a shockwave of disbelief and panic through the entire French army. Cries of "La Garde recule! The Guard recoils!" spread like wildfire. Sensing the moment was right, Wellington ordered a general advance of his entire line. At the same time, Blücher's Prussians launched a ferocious assault on the French right flank. Trapped between these two relentless forces, the French army began to collapse. Order gave way to chaos as discipline crumbled and soldiers fled in disarray. Watching his final bid for power slip away, Napoleon could do nothing but retreat. As his staff urged him to leave the field, he reportedly muttered, "All is lost," before being escorted to safety. The Battle of Waterloo was over. As the sun set on the blood-soaked fields of Waterloo on June 18, 1815, the once mighty French army disintegrated into a chaotic and desperate retreat. The defeat of the elite Imperial Guard, a sight that had shattered any remaining morale, turned an organized withdrawal into a desperate flight for survival. Darkness fell, but it brought no respite, only a new kind of horror. The Prussian cavalry, unleashed in a relentless pursuit and led by the vengeful Field Marshal Blücher, fell upon the fleeing French like wolves upon a scattered flock. The night echoed with thundering hooves, the sharp crack of carbines, and the cries of the fallen, as the Prussians, still smarting from their defeat at Ligny, exacted their terrible price. Amidst the chaos of the pursuit, the two victorious commanders, the Duke of Wellington and Field Marshal Blücher, met near the Inn of La Belle Alliance. Their handshake, in the flickering torchlight, amidst the wreckage of battle, was quiet, exhausted, but resolute. It marked the definitive end of Napoleon's last campaign and the dawn of a new, uncertain European era. While the Allied leaders celebrated their hard-won victory, Napoleon himself fled the battlefield, a fugitive from the disaster he had wrought. He raced towards Paris, arriving late on the 21st of June, a mere shadow of his former self. He had left the city just weeks before as a confident emperor, cheered by his people. He returned as a defeated general, his army destroyed, his face gaunt with exhaustion, his aura of invincibility gone forever. The political landscape in Paris, which had been so receptive to him during his triumphant return from Elba, had shifted with brutal speed. The news of the devastating outcome at Waterloo had spread through the capital, and his political support had evaporated overnight, replaced by fear, recrimination, and demands for his abdication. He briefly considered continuing the fight, attempting to rally the legislative chambers and the nation for one last defensive struggle to protect Paris. However, it quickly became clear that France, exhausted by more than 2 decades of nearly constant warfare, had no appetite for further conflict. The men who had once trembled before him, the politicians and ministers, now stood firm, demanding an end to the bloodshed and the reign of the man who had brought ruin upon them once more. Faced with this stark reality, his political life in ruins, Napoleon knew the game was over. On the 22nd of June 1815, just over 100 days after he had triumphantly reclaimed his throne, he sat in his study at the Élysée Palace and, with a heavy heart, signed his name to his second and final abdication. In a last attempt to secure his dynasty's future and preserve some vestige of his legacy, he proclaimed his young son emperor, writing, "My political life is ended, and I proclaim my son, under the title of Napoleon II, Emperor of the French." But this final gesture proved futile. The victorious Allies would not accept it, and the name of Napoleon II would be a mere footnote in the annals of history. In the following days, Napoleon, now a prisoner in his own country, retreated to the palace of Malmaison, the former home he had shared with his beloved Josephine. As the Allied forces closed in on Paris, the former emperor, the man who had once dictated terms to the kings of Europe, made several thwarted attempts to arrange for his escape, hoping perhaps to flee to a new life in America. But the British Royal Navy blockaded the ports, and every path was closed. The net was tightening. Finally, on the 15th of July 1815, accepting the inevitable, he made his final move. He surrendered himself to the captain of the British warship HMS Bellerophon, Captain Frederick Maitland. In a famous letter addressed to the British Prince Regent, he cast his surrender not as a plea for mercy from a defeated enemy, but as a grand, historic, and almost literary gesture. He wrote, "Your Royal Highness, a victim to the factions which divide my country, and to the enmity of the greatest powers of Europe, I have terminated my political career, and I come, like Themistocles, to throw myself upon the hospitality of the British people. I put myself under the protection of their laws, which I claim from your Royal Highness, as the most powerful, the most constant, and the most generous of my enemies." He was comparing himself to the great Athenian general who, defeated by his own people, sought refuge with his former Persian enemies. Even in his ultimate defeat, Napoleon was attempting to shape his own legend, to cast himself as a figure of classical tragedy, a great man brought down by fate, seeking refuge with the only enemy he deemed his equal. The emperor was no more. The final act of the great drama was complete. The ship weighed anchor, and as it sailed out into the Atlantic, Napoleon watched the shores of France, the continent he had once ruled, disappear into the mist for the very last time. The British government, wary of Napoleon's enduring influence and determined not to repeat the mistake of Elba, chose for his final exile the remote and isolated island of St. Helena. Imagine a tiny speck of volcanic rock in the vast, empty expanse of the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from the shores of Europe, a place of windswept cliffs and profound loneliness. This was to be the final home and prison for the man who had once ruled a continent. As the British ship sailed southward for weeks on end, Napoleon would have watched the familiar constellations of the northern sky disappear, replaced by the strange stars of the south. He was leaving his world behind, forever. Upon his arrival, he spent his remaining years in isolation, his world reduced to a few square miles of windswept rock. The former emperor was now a captive, living under strict British supervision, his every move watched, his correspondence read. His days, which had once been filled with the thrill of battle and the grand administration of an empire, were now marked by a quiet, monotonous routine. Yet, even in this confinement, Napoleon's mind remained fiercely active. His final battle was not to be fought with cannons and cavalry, but with pen and paper. It was to be the battle for his own legacy. He spent much of his time on St. Helena reflecting on his extraordinary life, dictating his memoirs to the small group of loyal followers who had accompanied him into exile. In a small, damp house at Longwood, he would pace the floor for hours, refighting his old campaigns, justifying his decisions, and carefully crafting the narrative that he wanted history to remember. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the great powers gathered at the Congress of Vienna resumed their monumental task of reshaping the continent in the aftermath of his final defeat. Their decisions would have profound and lasting consequences, redrawing borders, restoring monarchies, and establishing a new balance of power that would define European politics for decades to come. Determined to prevent the rise of another dominant force like Napoleon, they sought to create stability by containing France and reinforcing the principle of legitimacy, reinstating many of the monarchs he had deposed. They were attempting to put the world back as it was. But some of the changes Napoleon had wrought could not be undone. His true legacy, the part of his empire that would endure, was not built on the battlefield or drawn on the shifting maps of Europe. It was something quieter, more permanent, etched not in the glory of victory, but in the stone of law. It was the Napoleonic Code. This comprehensive system of civil law was perhaps his greatest and most lasting achievement. It swept away the confusing and inequitable tangle of old feudal laws and replaced them with a clear, rational system based on the principles of equality before the law, the right to hold property, and religious tolerance. It bound nations together not with the chains of conquest, but with the foundations of justice. This code would not only shape modern French law but would continue to influence legal systems across the continent and around the world, a quiet, legal revolution that outlasted all the cannon fire. And then there was the other legacy, the one that could not be written down or codified. It was the myth, the legend, the flame in memory. He was more than a general or an emperor, he was a force of nature, a symbol of what was possible, for both good and ill. He was the little corporal, who had risen from obscurity to become the master of a continent, a testament to the power of ambition, genius, and an indomitable will. He was the reformer who had spread the ideals of the revolution, and the conqueror who had caused the deaths of millions. His complex legacy would be debated for centuries, a source of endless fascination, inspiration, and cautionary tales. On his lonely rock in the ocean, the emperor's health began to fail. He died on the 5th of May 1821. His life, which had been a whirlwind of sound and fury, ended in the profound quiet of his small island room. His empire was gone. His power was a memory. But the world he had touched, the world he had awakened, would never truly be at rest again. The echo of his life, the story of his rise and fall, would continue to resonate through history. And so, our long journey through this epic tale comes to its gentle close. As you now settle into the final, deepest stages of your rest, let the story fade. Let the echoes of history dissolve into the quiet peace of this present moment. There is nothing left for you to do but to let go, to surrender to the stillness, and to rest. Sleep now. Sleep deeply.